I'm Rosalind Bandy. I'll take this off. I have the privilege of leading sustainability for TLMI, the Trade Association for the Label Industry. And welcome to our Eco Stage. Over the next 3 days, we have 6 speakers per day on a variety of topics, all having to do with some aspect of sustainability. Right now, we are going to hear from 2 gentlemen that are both TLMI members and are also employees of 2 of the largest label converting companies in the industry. And they're going to talk to you a bit about brands and their sustainability goals and trends that you should be watching for. So I'd like to introduce Tyler Matusevich from Brook & Whittle and Tim Bohlke from Resource Label Group.
Thank you, Ross. Oh, are we on?
We on? Mic's up. Good? Okay. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Thanks, Roz. Thanks, TLMI and Label Expo for hosting us. As she said, I'm Tyler Matusevich, Sustainability Director at Brook & Whittle. Come from the industry. I worked for UPM Raffletech for a little over 5 years before joining Brook & Whittle. Background is in packaging science as well. Tim?
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Ross, for hosting. Thanks for coming. Tim Bohlke, Director of Sustainability at Resource Label Group. I think the best way to sum up my career would be I've worked either for brands or with brands over the past 30 years. So I've seen a lot, as some of you have, and there's some great things happening. And certainly I hope you have some questions for us as well at the end before we go through a couple of slides and take some questions as well. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about understanding brands' trends and sustainability goals today. We'll just dive right on in. So I just wanted to start with the waste hierarchy. It's still widely accepted. Prevent, and then the 4 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, recover. Nothing new here, probably preaching to the choir. But we don't really talk a lot about reducing, but it's obviously still it's at the top of the food chain here in terms of the waste hierarchy. Obviously in terms of label materials, if you get more labels per roll, there's some efficiencies there and leads to some sustainability benefits. But the brands have also been driving reduction strategies throughout their operations and throughout their packaging formats for many, many years. Reuse is one that's kind of caught on more recently. Most of you are probably familiar with Loop by TerraCycle. That's a popular program that many of the brands are trying to become members of and kind of go back to this old milkman model. It has its place. It's kind of a niche market at the moment, but we'll see that continue to grow for the brands as well, and how that impacts the label use in terms of designing for reusability is something we need to focus on as members here at the Label Expo. Recycling, that's one we really all know, and that's the one we really kind of focus on. And obviously it's a little bit further down the pecking order, but we do need to design for a circular economy and keep those materials in the loop. We'll talk a little bit more about that later for design for recycling with APR guidelines and things like that. And then kind of last but not least, if you can't do those strategies, then waste to energy is a good avenue. Second bullet point here is 100% recyclable, reusable, or compostable plastic packaging. Pretty much all the CPG companies have this goal by 2025. Any of the large CPG companies, some of the smaller brands are starting to have similar goals as well. I will say that if they don't have that goal already, California passed a bill, and by 2032, there's 100% reusable or compostable packaging by that date set forth by California legislation. And really, Emily Topaldo is here as well, and she'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of the brands, large CPG companies and their goals. Increasing recycled content and renewables, this is another thing the brands are obviously striving to do. There is some cost increases on those, at least at the moment, but it's still something that a lot of the brands are trying to implement into their packaging, including into the labels. So recycled content can be PCR in the plastics realm, or PCW in the paper materials for post-consumer waste. And then renewables, right? So this is things like bio-based polyethylene, bio-based polypropylene, that can be made from, say, tall oil residue. I know UPM has those products as well, and do that from the tall oil from the pulping process. And then there's also other renewables like PLA, PHA. Those are gaining some traction in certain markets. So it's something to be aware of and continue to monitor as we go forward. Policy landscape, so this is a really big one. Was talked a little bit about yesterday at the AWA, if you were at the AWA meeting. EPR is extended producer responsibility. And if you're not familiar with EPR, it's essentially, they're still kind of working out the kinks, but it will be essentially a fee that will be associated with different packaging materials. Those fees will probably go into a PRO, a producer responsibility organization, and then the PRO will divvy out those funds for recycling infrastructure, awareness campaigns, things of that nature. Design for recycling and the policy landscape. If you saw California pass SB 343, they have included the APR guidelines into that. They're still kind of doing a material classification until January 1st of 2024. But when they ultimately decide on that, the APR guidelines that are called out in that bill are basically saying to not use unrecyclable packaging components or labels. So we really do need to, as an industry, follow those APR guidelines for recyclability. And then there's also some policy around collection and PCR mandates that the brands are having to follow. PCR mandates on clamshells and in the primary package of their containers. Next is chain of custody. So switching a little bit from the plastic side over to the paper side, we've had quite a few brands of our customers ask for a chain of custody certified material. The most popular one is FSC, Forest Stewardship Council. It's a globally recognized chain of custody certification for paper fibers. And if you don't have access to FSC, there's SFI, which is a North American chain of custody certification, and PEFC in Europe is heavily used. ISCC is a little different. We typically see that on filmed materials, so either bio-based or renewable-based films, or in recycled content, and they usually do that through a mass balance system to get certification there. But so it's something to keep your mind on for chain of custody. The next three I listed here is Climate Pledge, World Without Waste, and Waste Free World. So if you've not heard of these, you probably should have. Climate Pledge is Amazon. They have announced that, and it's basically to get to net zero emissions by 2040, 10 years ahead of the Paris Accord of 2050. World Without Waste is Coca-Cola, and Waste Free World is Unilever's initiative. And within these different initiatives, there's other brands I could have put on there. I just put 3 of the big CPG companies. Within those, net zero is typically called out in all of them. Circular economy principles and practices are called out, and zero waste to landfill. Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, it kind of relates to the net zero carbon emissions that we're all trying to achieve by a certain date to prevent climate change to the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. We are starting to get more involved in Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions at Brook & Whittle, and I think the industry as a whole. We are now calculating those emissions as a company. We partner with a company called Emitwise to help us calculate that, do the carbon accounting and management of that. And the reason we did that is because we're getting asked for that information from our brands, but also in various ESG scorecards and things that Tim will touch on here in the next slide. And then Ellen MacArthur Foundation, they've kind of been quiet for a little while, but the U.S. Plastics Pact came from the EMF. And again, Emily will talk about that at the 1 o'clock hour, so I'll let her, I won't steal her thunder there.
Before you go to the next slide,
Yeah.
I wanted to show a couple examples of what Tyler was mentioning. Take a look at this brand that we all love. I mean, it's already, they just call it right out. I mean, so what better place to advertise, for your brand than on the label, right? So that goes back to the 100% recyclable. Another one is compostable. Definitely, a trend, and you'll see this bag. You might have seen it with Doritos at one point, but calling it out right in front of the consumer and educating them right on the package. Brands that are doing this are smart, without a doubt, and there's a long way to go for a lot of these brand owners, for sure. I think a favorite yogurt, certainly of mine, is Chobani, and as small as that cup is to put information on, they still put a message on there about tear the sleeve off, recycle the cup. Technically, they should have a product that you should be able to throw the whole container away, but essentially, they're giving instructions to the consumers to do that. Another brand that, when you're ahead of, when you have those brand relationships, thank you, with redesigns, this is a great Bloody Mary mix. We worked with this brand on the front end of their redesign. They went from a glass bottle to a plastic bottle. They also use a recyclable solution, and they call that out on their label. And I think at the end of the day, brands have to use that label space, and you don't have an excuse for not doing that. And you can always send them to a website, but I think ultimately speaking to them on the package is a great start. Flip down, how do you turn it down here?
Yeah, it should.
There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about transparency and accountability. You may have heard ESG. It's essentially environmental, social, governance criteria. I mean, it's a framework for your entire organization to follow. It's not just the environmental guys, the sustainability guys. It brings in your HR folks. It brings in your finance folks. It brings in your legal teams. It's critical, and when you start to talk to your finance folks about the value of your company, this is one area that you want to bring in everybody to talk to about. And our company's done a great job of that. EcoVadis and CDP are ultimately scorecards. Everybody's probably heard of the Walmart scorecard. These are industry scorecards for sustainability ratings. And I'm happy to say that our EcoVadis score was driven by a brand that wanted us to get it, but we've got a silver out of it. We're going to go for the gold, of course, but they will give you those sustainability ratings when you sign up there. Similar to CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, where you measure, disclose, you essentially open up your books to them and tell them, here's what we're doing, here's what we're striving towards. It's also sometimes, it look back at what you've done, not necessarily about what you've looked forward in doing. We've all heard of science-based target initiatives. These are what Tyler was mentioning, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. These are science-based targets. These are goals. You're seeing a lot of 2025 is going to be here before we know it. 2030, Tyler mentioned the 2032 for California. Those are critical best practices that you want to make sure you are measuring and have your own goals out there. So why do these matter to brands? I mean, ultimately, it matters to the consumers that are buying those brands, right? I mean, that's why they're doing it. I'm sure some of these brands would sometimes not have to do that, use that space for other marketing initiatives, but it's clear that consumers want sustainable packaging. So, as you're working with brand owners, aligning on common goals and shared goals. Here's ours, here's yours, where can we come together to work together and meet those? Obviously, we've heard of the Paris agreements and the climate change. It's real, right? If you don't know that, you're not watching the news. But climate change is here. We're certainly going to try to do our part in our own swim lane of recycled content in our packaging, or whatever that might entail. I mean, certainly, when you talk about ESG, you talk about addressing human rights and the well-being of not only your employees, but the folks that you're working with. And supplier rating systems, the majors all have that. So you should work with those folks and your suppliers in making sure that those supplier ratings, that they're also, being transparent with you as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit from my side of things. We at Brook & Whittle have been asked for EcoVadis, so we're actively doing that assessment as we speak. And then the same thing on the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So one of our large CPG companies, customers, has actually asked us for SBTI by the end of 2023. So that's why we're starting to measure our emissions and then are going to be reporting into the SBTI in the near future. So again, large brands are asking for that. So if whether you're a printer out there servicing them or whether you're a supplier, the trickle-down effect could come through. You may be asked for SBTI, EcoVadis, CDP, et cetera, in the very, very near future as well. Switching gears just a little bit here, I want to talk about printers because obviously there's a lot of printers here, and we service those large CPG companies, right? So what can you do as a printer? A lot of basic things on here, but you've probably heard take a holistic approach, right? What do we mean by taking a holistic approach? It's really implementing sustainability practices throughout your organization. So whether that's the ideation and product development design stage, whether that is your sourcing department, working with the suppliers that are here today, production, supply chain, product use phase, designing for that end of life, right? So if it's a PET container, using wash-off materials, using crystallizable shrink or polyolefin floatable shrink sleeve materials, things like that. So designing for the end of life is key. And then those partnerships, which we'll touch on in the next slide a little bit as well. Set goals and take action, very simple, but I like to say you can't manage what you can't measure. So measure it first, then you can manage it, set those goals, have KPIs, and take action to reach those KPIs. And that ultimately the brands are starting to look for those things. Again, they're doing that. How are they judging you? They're judging you through those different scorecards that Tim touched on. Sustainable Green Printing Partnership. So I know Brook & Whittle we're actively seeking SGP now, and I think Wendy is speaking tomorrow, I believe. She's the lead auditor for SGP and also ISO 14001. Those are environmental management systems, sometimes called sustainability management systems, and really what they help you do is to measure, manage, drive continuous improvements, and then reduce your footprint effectively. Design for recycling and reuse. We touched on this a little bit already. Whether it's in policy with APR guidelines, whether it's designing labels that will help for the Loop by TerraCycle program, again, low volume stuff right now, but a growing platform and format, and really just drive that circular economy, right? So work closely with your suppliers. If you walk around this show, 99% of the booths are probably going to have something to do with sustainability, and that's for obvious reasons. They're being asked for it, the brands are asking for it, the world is asking for it. So again, just work closely with your suppliers. They have the solutions, and they're all here today. Monitor the policy landscape. That's kind of a tough one to do if you're not into it every day, but there's different groups you can follow to follow policy landscape, but it will affect our industry. It already is, as I mentioned with California and SB 343 and also I think SB 54. So again, monitor this policy landscapes. One way to do that is join TLMI. They have a regulatory affairs committee, and within that regulatory affairs committee, they are following the policy landscape and how it will impact our industry as a printer converter.
Good. That's good. The next slide is going to speak to partnerships, and this is key. I mean, there's a lot of great partners out there. TLMI is definitely one of them. They've got sustainability committees, so the last bullet point from Tyler's side was get involved. Join those committees, work with Roz, great leader for TLMI. There's Matrix, there's release liners, they address the waste streams, there's regulatory affairs, label leaders of tomorrow, that's going to be, I think they've got an event tomorrow night somewhere, which is very cool. The Association of Plastic Recyclers, Steve Alexander is in the house. Both Tyler and my companies are members. He's waving at me. He's open for dinner tonight. I had to cancel my dinner with him. No, an amazing organization, leading voice of plastics industry. The design guide has labels in it. It evolves, it changes. It's changing due to some of our supplier activities, which is great to see. Obviously now, no non-recyclable components being called out. The APRs, they work closely with retailers. They've got a great relationship with Walmart, Target, and others. So it's critical that there are others in the value chain that are members as well. SPC is another great to be a member of. They do a wonderful job of taking groups out to show them what recyclers look like, to take them to bottle recyclers, to see it, not just talk about it. A lot of conferences do a lot of talking. It's great, but sometimes when you can go and see the process and walk a line and watch a glass bottle get crushed, get melted down, returned back into a bottle, it's a pretty cool thing to see. And of course, C-Lab, which we certainly know that C-Lab's been around for a couple of years now. And it's another place to talk about the circular economy for labels and good partners in that group as well. So I think that's all we have for the slides. We do have some more packaging. I could talk about packaging and the recyclability of them all day long. I think when you walk a Whole Foods store, that's definitely a company that is geared towards sustainable products. This was just water. I just got this last night. A great product. It's again a paper-based. They tell their whole story on it. which is great. They're not members of How to Recycle, but that's certainly a group that they should, and other brands should look at, the How to Recycle. If you're not mentioning that to your companies that you're working with, you should. It's definitely a place to send them to from a recyclability perspective.
Yeah, I'll just add in a little plug real quick that the Label Leaders of Tomorrow is tomorrow at 4 o'clock at one of some brewery nearby.
Yeah.
So try to join that. It's on the program if you're a TLMI member. And then How to Recycle, you had the logos right here on the Zing Zang. If you're not familiar with How to Recycle, right here, I mean, there's the label. So just keep that in mind. A lot of the brands are starting to use the How to Recycle label. And yeah, in the spirit of TLMI, I had to wear my TLMI socks, Ross.
I noticed. Beautiful. Hey, if you guys have a little time, I think we've got some questions in the audience. Do you mind answering some questions?
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to start with this lady.
I'm from Europe, and we are already a member of CLAC.
Can't hear.
I was just wondering, is it possible to share your presentation, please?
Yes.
Of course.
Because it's a lot of information about industry organizations who are looking at sustainability and recycling, and I will not remember when I'm leaving this chair. So, if that's possible.
Yes.
Of course, of course.
Sure. If you want to give me your email address, we can email it to you. Other questions? Sure.
Hey guys, the question I have for you is in terms of working directly with brands. It seems there can sometimes be a conflict in terms of departments within the brand. You have marketing, you have procurement, you have sustainability, you have R&D. Now, all those different huts have different interests. I was wondering if either of you could talk a little bit about how you might align those groups to see the bigger picture on some of this stuff, or in some of the examples where you've worked with redesigns. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, ultimately, no matter what size the brand, you've got to find your champion inside that organization. That's not an easy thing to do. But when you find them, you want to hook into them, and you want to stay connected for a long time, because those industry leaders are the voice inside of their own organization. And there's a few out there. There's not many, but I think when you can sit down at a table and, to your point, have sustainability there, have packaging, have procurement, so we all can come together to figure out, right, the end goal is what? We just want to give you a better product, right? We want to give you something that will enhance your brand and help you sell more product. That's what they want to do, right? So how do you do that? You're exactly right. You've got to bring those champions together and stay connected throughout the process. And sometimes you're going to win, and sometimes you're going to lose. I mean, that's the reality too. It depends on the organization, right? Depending on their footprint of what they're trying to accomplish. And we've all heard the pushback on cost at times, right? That's procurement. But let's go talk to sustainability and see if there's budgets out there. We know who has them inside the organization. A lot of it's marketing, and certainly some of these big brands can, they care enough to put those dollars into their package from that perspective. But it's a great question. Absolutely.
Yeah, the last meeting, I had a meeting a couple weeks ago with a brand, and we actually had, on the call was procurement, we had a person from marketing, and you have a packaging engineer all on the same call. So, I mean, it's easier said than done, but the procurement teams are starting to get more involved in the sustainability decision and education. So that's good to see, because obviously, it's their pocket.
Good question.
Other questions? Anybody else? Sure.
Are the brands driving towards any sort of alignment on evaluation of sustainability of different packaging types? Because I saw you point out a paper-based bottle to replace what I'm assuming would be a PET fully recyclable bottle-to-bottle, and I struggle to see how that is a more sustainable solution. So are there those kinds of conversations happening at the brands?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you see, where glass has gone away, right, to lightweight a product. You've seen that in a lot of the food categories. I think it's not, there's no goal line here, right? I mean, there's a continuation of your brand evolving. And depending on what your DNA is of that brand owner, there's going to be certain packages for certain concepts, right? You're never going to get away from that plastic bottle. But you can tell those consumers, hey, look, you can 100% recycle this, and we're good. And that circularity is key there. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it's not easy, right? If you're a brand owner, you're ultimately what? You're trying to win at the shelf, or you're trying to win direct to consumer. Direct to consumer has been a huge category for a lot of different brands that aren't on the shelf yet, right?
Yeah, I would just say there's not really a silver bullet, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's really no silver bullet answer to sustainable packaging, so they're looking for any and all solutions. Again, if you kind of follow the waste hierarchy, right? I mean, reducing, a lot of people are moving to flexible packaging. You can say that's good or bad. Obviously, it's heavily lightweighting the material. There's some solutions that are mono material. It can be stored, drop off, recycled. But obviously, rigid packaging, widely recyclable. If it's a PET container, HDPE container, we just need to increase the collection of that material. Steve Alexander will talk on that a little bit more later on, but we could simply double our recycling capacity. We have the capacity to double the recycling of those containers as we speak. We just don't have the collection in place. So there's, again, there's not a silver bullet, but they're all looking for solutions.
No, it's a great question because brands do have to keep things fresh too for their retailers. They're reviewed every year as well, and it's not always just about how the numbers look. It's how's the package look. What are you doing differently to gain share yourself and to make sure you keep that shelf space, right? We've seen brands. I'm sure I know Tyler's seen them, where 1 year they're on PS, 2 years later they're on shrink, right? Or they come back to, they flip back and forth. Again, marketing wants to keep it fresh, keep it interesting to the consumer and keep them coming back. You capture them, you convert them, you trade them up, hopefully, to other products in their categories. Think about bar soap 25, 30 years ago. Bar soap was a 12-foot section of bar soap. You can't find bar soap. It's on the bottom shelf. It's all liquid. It's all body washes. So many categories out there like that evolve. Again, I'm old enough to remember there was no bottled water on the shelf, right? That's calling my age out. But, at the end of the day, now you've got 12, 24 feet of water out there, right? And it's a battle at the shelf. So how do you give yourself a point of difference?